and they're still independent, they're just a bit confused, and this is called mild cognitive impairment or MCI. And then there are people who have reached that clinical threshold to necessitate a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, hereafter AD. Now, Alzheimer's disease has a long prodromal stage where the neuropathology of the disease can exist at low levels without the corresponding or associated cognitive deterioration. Now, people can exist for weeks, months, years permanently in this state. Some people go on to develop MCI, and some people just stay at MCI rather than developing full-blown Alzheimer's. Now, this gives us an opportunity to say, okay, if we can predict who's going to transfer from these three states to a more worse diagnosis, then we have the opportunity to implement intervention studies or implement interventions. So you might think, okay, we can't delay dementia, but actually a recent meta-review by Lancet, the journal, which they do every year, suggests that up to 45% of Alzheimer's disease may be preventable across the lifespan. So things like having less education when you're a kid, moving towards diabetes and obesity in midlife, and then social isolation, air pollution, and that type of thing in later life. So 45%. So it's got to the point now where we know it's not inevitable. And so therefore, if we can isolate those or identify those individuals who are at risk and implement these interventions, we may be able to prevent up to 45% of Alzheimer's disease. Now, how do we do this? So there is a concept, well, one of the ways that we do this is by reinforcing cognitive reserve. So there's a concept called cognitive reserve, and well, I like to think of it like the beams on an old cottage roof, okay? So imagine there's snow, well, you don't have to imagine, there's an AI-generated image there. So the more snow that goes on the roof, the more it's going to be under strain. Now, the more beams it has, the more snow it's going to be able to take before the roof collapses, okay? So you can think about the snow as the neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease, for example, the amyloid plaque, neurofibrillary tangles. People do display and have been shown to have that neuropathology, but don't have the corresponding cognitive deterioration, and part of that may be due to cognitive reserve. So things like socializing, things like there's evidence of Mediterranean diet, for example, things like being in an intellectually stimulating job, and so on. Now, another thing that I'm probably going to be later, but I'll try to speed up. So another potential for the application of AI prediction for Alzheimer's disease is that recently we have there has been the development of drugs which for the first time have been shown to both clear the neuropathology of the disease while also reversing the cognitive deterioration. The problem is, and one of the reasons why it's been rejected by the NHS in this country, is it's only able to work on people who are diagnosed in a super early fashion, and it only works in a very small subset of people, and apparently the side effects are particularly unpleasant. But this highlights the need for that early diagnosis, and the reason why it's so exciting is, to quote one scientist on Twitter, back when scientists were on Twitter, it shows that for the first time we have developed drugs which can hurt Alzheimer's disease or the neuropathology, and if it bleeds, we can kill it, which I think is a quote from Predator. So AI within healthcare applications has lagged behind other applications of AI. You know, there's AI on our phones, there's AI on our TVs, there's a whole host of things that we're using AI for. But medical applications have lagged behind. And within the domain of dementia, there are a bunch of different reasons why. Firstly, this over-reliance on unrepresentative, expensive or invasive data, bad methodologies, lack of explainability, lack of obvious usability in existing clinical practice, and limited data, and expensive in time to collect more rather. Now, over the last 5 years, myself and my lab at Goldsmiths, the Data Science and Software Computing Lab, have been aiming to address some of these needs or some of these obstacles. So So we can talk about the first set of studies that we published, where we were trying to predict, based on classical classification models, what diagnoses a person will receive at the end of a study period, based on what diagnosis they had at the start of the study period. So you can imagine we're following these patients as participants over weeks, months, and years. At some point they come to the study centre for the first time and they have a diagnosis. And they have the data collection across the study period. And then what we say is, once they stop coming to the study and receive their final diagnosis, what can we predict what that diagnosis will be? And crucially, can we predict whether that participant has deteriorated? Okay? Does that make sense? And so therefore, what we used was a very, very widely used study called ADNI, which is 80% white and wholly US based. And so it falls into that problem of unrepresentative data, but we were able to obtain other data which is focused more on underrepresented populations in order to validate that not only were we able to predict, based on the baseline measurements, whether that person is likely to deteriorate, but we were able to validate that on non-white, non-Western data sets. We focused on methods that are less black boxy, so it's all very well and good having these deep learning fancy, LLM-based models, but when we're looking at specifically a medical domain, we need to be able to explain not just what our predictions are, but how they're obtained. So if I come to a doctor and say, that woman's going to get cancer, the doctor's going to say, how do you know? And I'm going to say, well, my model told me. It's not really acceptable. And so therefore we focused on methods which were more inclined towards that sort of being able to lift the lid on the black box. And then we set about making more common the adherence to standardized reporting methodologies in order to make the publication more transparent and more easily replicated. But there's a problem here because ultimately these studies are classification studies, right? So they treat, they're able to say whether someone is likely to develop a Alzheimer's disease, yes, no, but they don't account for the inherent temporal element of the disease. This disease progresses over weeks, months, and years, okay? And so therefore we can't account for the influence of time. Now the classical classification models do not do this, but survival-based models, in particular the Cox proportional hazard model, has this concept of hazards being moderated by time, which are then moderated by the features as time goes on. So it's time point 0, time point 1, time point 2. The features will then moderate that hazard, meaning that we end up with a timeline of risk for participants, giving clinicians and participants a lot better information and being able to model that temporal element. Now the classic Cox proportional hazard model is very good at doing this, but it doesn't scale well to high dimensional data, which is classic sort of what cohort data looks like, right? In comparison, machine learning models do scale to high dimensional data, but they're not very good, as I said, to modeling time. And so recently, what has happened is people have combined such that we have survival-based AI, so your sort of random forest, your deep learning, your neural networks, your transformers, but with the underpinning of that theoretical framework of the Cox proportional hazard model. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So our contribution to this area, first of all, we use the English longitudinal study of aging to establish for the first time, or one of the first, that the survival-based AI does indeed perform better than the standard Cox proportional hazard model. And that was something that was in dispute. My supervisor, my second supervisor out at King's, said he had a tweet that said, oh, we'll never find a study that proves that survival AI is better than Cox. And when I did, he said, I'm going to edit my tweet, and then he didn't, which was disappointing. So then we looked at validating the ELSA study on again, the admin, and then we looked at things like comparing linear versus non-linear models. Okay? So for the first time, we were able to look at things like survival around the forest, which applies its trade on data that is very much a bit more, I guess, complicated in the relationships between risk and outcome. Then we were able to look at survival neural networks, for example, survival deep hit, which produced good results, but again, we had that question of what the black box, whether it was sufficiently explainable in order to really work within a clinical setting. And then finally, we talked about survival transformers. Now, this basically says what I just said. Now, let's talk about survival transformers. So, looking at these two statements, what are they? This is a call and response moment. They're sentences, right? Of varying lengths. But what are they also? They're timelines. Okay? So the trick, which I didn't come up with, I wish I had, was to treat temporal data as if it's a sentence. So actually at time point 0, time point 1, time point 2, each of these are words in a sentence which are made up of the specific temporal time point and then a linear combination of the features at that time point. And from there, what you can do is you can modify a transformer, which is the architecture that underpins things like ChatGPT or the other ones, and therefore you can model the risk of developing dementia with a lot more depth because of this very rich and very complex transformer architecture. But again, what do we have in terms of, we have good predictability, but ultimately we don't have that explainability. Now, we talk about 60% of new dementia cases being in developing economies, which are predominantly non-white. Now, almost all of the commonly used data sets, ADNI, 80% of the studies in neuroimaging prediction studies use ADNI. The vast majority of studies use data sets that are wholly white, wholly Western based. Okay? There are recently some efforts to collect data within non-white, non-Western countries. For example, India has just started a study a few years ago called the Longitudinal Aging Study of India, which is the most pleasing acronym of LASSI, if you know your Indian roots. So there has been a focus to really prioritize collecting that type of non-white data. Unfortunately, this takes years, and so another way to approach it is to create synthetic data. Okay? So for the last two of our papers, we created variational autoencoders, which is a type of model which can generate synthetic data based on data that we originally have, a small amount of data that we have from underrepresented populations, and then immediately we could spin up, potentially infinite amounts of data, which is similar, shares the similar distributions and traits as the data set from underrepresented populations, but it is obviously a fraction of the cost to collect. Also, obviously, it makes things cheaper. Now, the most recent study, and the study I presented last week, I think, in Cyprus, was, so we talked about the fluid biomarkers which are collected via lumbar puncture. We talked about how it's not a very good time to be strapped down and drilled into your spine, collect the cerebral spinal fluid. So what people have been starting to do is move towards more blood-based biomarkers, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation recently launched an initiative to explore this area, right? I was part of, I think, one of the sub-studies for this, where we use the biomimesis data in order to look specifically at proteomics collected via blood tests. Okay? So instead of having that unpleasant procedure, or alternatively, instead of undergoing a PET scan, where they inject you with radioactive material and put you through a scanner, which if you're potentially confused from cognitive deterioration would be a pretty disorientating experience, I would imagine. We compared that against combining both proteomic blood-based data with neuropsychological tests in order to see whether we could predict someone's current diagnostic status in terms of CN, MCI, and AD. So we have 2 papers. One was accepted and presented last week at a conference in Cyprus. We are looking to extend this to a full journal paper, which will be submitted in the next few weeks. So we were able to demonstrate that this combination of neuropsychological tests and blood-based biomarkers was able to predict the diagnostic status of participants. So the conclusion after everything, after 5 years, is I'm very tired. But also the actual conclusion, and what you're probably here for, is that I hope I've sort of conveyed that AD is a very complicated illness. And those 3, by the way, those 3, CN, MCI, AD, those aren't set in stone at all. Like one man's mild cognitive impairment is another guy's bad day, you know? So like, these are not, although they are diagnostic criteria, they are not set in stone. I met a guy coming out of the University of Johannesburg who actually was able to identify 10 subtypes for mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so it's an extremely complicated disease, and it has a number of challenges associated with it, not just within the realm of AI prediction, but in general. But within AI prediction and clinical prediction modeling as a discipline, there are a number of obstacles which have prevented more medical AI models from being applied within healthcare domains. The last 5 tiring years, we've been attempting to address and produce papers which have addressed these areas. However, there's more to do, which means I won't be sleeping anytime soon. So yeah, that's me. Thank you for your time. Any questions? Yep.
Hey, thanks for the wonderful talk. You probably answered this already, but one question that strikes me is, are there any other correlational environmental factors that can help predict early onset of any class of dementia?
So early onset in particular has a strong genetic component. So familial Alzheimer's, which is a minority of cases of Alzheimer's, has a strong genetic component, and that one is most likely to be early onset. So sporadic Alzheimer's is the most common one, which is less of a genetic component. Although the ApoE4, which I mentioned, is a risk factor. But there are things like, for example, Shannon et al. In 2023 and others actually identified the Mediterranean diet as being a particular protective factor against Alzheimer's. When I was out in Cyprus, I spoke to one of our tour guides who was local, and I asked her, just out of interest, do you know anyone who has Alzheimer's or anyone who's been affected by it? And you know, I can ask that to this room, and there will be so many people. Almost everyone will know someone. Not in Cyprus. And that's anecdotal, but I think part of the reason is potentially that protective effect of the diet. Socializing is a good one, and it's great because it's fun. And exercise throughout the lifespan, protecting yourself against things like heart disease. Mental health issues are a big risk factor. Yeah, and then also things like losing your senses, particularly, actually if we go back to the Lancet, just the Lancet should be asked this question rather than Mirror. So things like vision loss later in life, excuse me, but also hearing loss midlife, so generally the loss of the senses, and also incidentally, delirium in older people, which is, my grandma had this fairly recently. Delirium in older people is a super big risk factor for, if people don't know what delirium is, it's when older people just start hallucinating and just be unsure of where they are, and it just comes on, and sometimes it can just go. My grandma was in hospital for 5 days, completely unaware of where she was, and then 5 days later later she was fine. But delirium increases your risk factor for elderly people. So yeah, there are a bunch of environmental things which have been linked to Alzheimer's.
How are these genetic tests like 23andMe predicting Parkinson's and Alzheimer's if it's not?
Sorry?
How are these genetic tests like 23andMe and a bunch of other companies who are claiming to do some genetic tests, how are they predicting this?
Yeah, so I don't know what 23andMe's thing is, but like, if they are to focus on anything, it will be that APOE4. So a few years ago, one of the 500 actors called Chris from the Marvel Cinematic Universe released a statement saying, "My doctors have told me that I'm super at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and now I'm going to go away and come up with a plan which probably involves a personal trainer and loads of money, right?" But I don't know for sure, but I suspect what he's been told is he has a particularly high expression of PA4. Any other questions? Yeah.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
So, very good work. I have a question in regards to the synthetic data you're using. How are you validating it? Are you using any conditions to support the validation of the synthetic data?
Any conditions?
Clinical,
Yeah, so we're validating it by modeling. So what we're doing is we've got the original data. We create the VAE, the variational autoencoder. We then create the synthetic data. We then train the model on the synthetic data. We validate it on the real data, and then we test it on the real data in order to see whether it's able to produce. No, that's wrong. Train on the synthetic data, validate on the synthetic data, test on the real data.
And you are scared of any biases connections there? Because you're using one set of just the small things of original data
Yeah, biases are a concern, and what I will say is that all of the studies presented here need to be validated on a sufficiently large data source. So things like ADNI, cohort data in general is finite, extremely finite in fact. And so the validation, external validation, which I was able to do, not on the VAE study, but in the deterioration and the survival machine learning and deep learning studies, were able to be validated on external data set. And this is essential within clinical modeling in general. Good question, thanks.
Sorry, thank you for the very nice talk. I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about the data. So, for example, like, do you use data from just patients or also, let's say, healthy individuals? Because the goal is to predict an early onset of Alzheimer's or dementia.
Yeah.
And in that case, more like using patient data is like already biasing the model to diagnose or like future diagnosis, like how would the early detection work in that case?
Yeah, so this isn't patient data, technically, it's cohort data. So this is, all of the studies use, have at least three of these diagnoses, but one of them isn't a diagnosis, one of them is baseline, so that's cognitively normal. So they're recruited cognitively healthy and neuropathologically healthy participants as a baseline. So it's not just people who turned up at a hospital, it's people who have been actively recruited, even if they're healthy.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. My question is kind of, I'm curious, let's say your algorithm predicts that this person is going to have dementia or AD, and your recommendation, is that also given by AI what to do? Is the recommendation still take medicine and do exercise? I mean, I'm trying to figure out the model once it's completed. Is it just to say you will get dementia, or will also provide some solutions?
So it definitely wouldn't provide recommendations because that should, I think, always remain with the clinician, right? And it's about what I used to call data-informed rather than data-driven modeling, right? So if you have one of the few medical AI models that is actually working within the NHS is down in King's College Hospital near Edgware Road, I think, where they have a AI model that detects images for breast cancer, right? So it says, oh, this person might have a shadow, or I don't really know how it works, but ultimately it sends that information to a radiologist, who then makes the final call. Okay, and so that in clinical applications, but also in a lot of other applications, that should always be the way it works, right? It's now called human in the loop rather than data informed, but that is particularly important within a clinical domain, because it's all about building confidence, right? We need people to have confidence in a model, and you can't get to a point, people are not going to trust a model who's just blindly assigning, you know, you have cancer, you have dementia, inshallah, off you go, you know? So that's the thing. So having that, the doctor in the loop will always be part of the plan. Alright?
Congratulations on the presentation that today we get this kind of academic level. Two quick questions. One is, have you tried for the time series any models like Salima, or algorithms which are, let's say, tuned for time series? And the second one, which is probably more with one interest, you said that there are 45% could be prevented. Are there any, to your knowledge, any actionable things which we can do, or people can do, not only, you know, eat vegetarian, probably something which is actionable, people can do in order to prevent?
Yeah. So to the first point, I don't think that mic is working, by the way. So to the first point, so technically speaking, this isn't time series data, right? So what it is we have people coming in at discrete points within, and so therefore it is irregular, right? So this participant may come in 7 times, this participant may come in 3 times, and then they'll all stop at different times. So we focus on models which use discrete modeling using cost proportional hazard model. And something else to say is that the cost proportional hazard model is super familiar to clinicians as well. And so therefore that helps with the idea of building confidence because clinicians understand it. Now to your second question, so there have been a number of studies, the Apple study, there's one coming out of Finland. The Apple study is ongoing, by the way. It's at UCL, I think. Where they identify people who are at risk, they assign them a sort of live tutor, where they essentially say, why don't you start engaging with exercises, why don't you start doing crossword puzzles, why don't you start doing engaging a bit more with your friends, and that type of thing, and that has been shown to have a marked impact, even at a late stage where someone has been identified at age 60 plus, for example. So there are actionable things that we can do. We just need to, because it's all very well telling everyone just to say, oh, exercise more and have a better life. You know, the government's been trying to do that for decades, and I do not have a very healthy life. I do a PhD, so I go to the territory, but like, I have a full-time job, so we need to target it better. We can target it, and there are actionable things that we can do.
I have a question about the large language model. I understand the machine learning bit, but why would you use a large language model to explain what? The last step, you have a model, right? A couple of steps. Some analysis, machine learning, all sorts of other things. Then the last step is large language model transformer.
Yeah.
To do what specifically?
So essentially, ultimately, it's trying to improve prediction of risk across time. And the insight that came from the paper that the actual model that I modified was from Lee et al. Coming out of Cambridge, the AI for medicine department. So ultimately, it's about improving the accuracy of risk across time. So it's not so much a large language model as it is, we've taken the architecture underpinning a large language model, we've modified it, and then we've said, hey, rows of data across time, kind of like a sentence. We can work with that. So that's why we ended up doing it. But the question becomes, if we get it to the point where we're super accurate across time, we're able to mold this timeline of risk, but we can't really explain how we're doing it because a transformer is so black boxy. We don't really understand how it reaches its decisions. What can we do? Well, one thing we can do is we can just focus on things like survival around the forest, which has predictor importance, that explainability inbuilt into it. But what if survival around the forest is not good enough? Then we go into explainable AI and trying to decode what's going on under the hood in the transformer model.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Henry, for
Yes.
that. I think